To the Business Rebellion, the podcast for founders and leaders who know something about the way business is done doesn't sit right anymore. Not because they're failing, but because the model is broken. This is where we talk about building businesses and wealth intentionally, not reactively, not emotionally, and not from ego. Today's episode is about property, but not from a hype perspective, not from a quit your job and flip houses angle, and definitely not from a status or social media lens. This is about property as a strategic asset class for founders, about optionality, about leverage, about calm. This is property as a business strategy. My guest today is Chris Gray. Chris is the CEO of Your Empire, a business that buys homes, holiday homes, and investment properties for time-poor professionals, handling the search, negotiation, and renovation on their behalf. He's been the host of Your Property Empire on Sky News Business for over a decade and served as the real estate judge on Channel 10's The Renovators. As a qualified accountant, mortgage broker, and buyer's agent, this brings a rare combination of technical expertise and market experience. He started buying property at 22, semi-retired at 31, and now holds over $20 million in property in his personal portfolio. But what I really respect about Chris is that he treats property as a strategy, not a spectacle. Chris, welcome to the Business Rebellion.
Wonderful. Thanks for having me, Kerrie.
Excited for you to be here. So for people who don't know your work yet, what kind of business owners usually come to you wanting to invest in property?
Sure. So I guess for most people, I guess they're generally already turning revenue, not necessarily turning profit, but they've got an established business and quite often they've been in it for a bit of time. And then really, I guess they're probably time poor because as we all know, a business is 24/7 pretty much. And they're either thinking that, look, I've got profits to reinvest, or maybe this business was a bit harder than I thought. And maybe I'm not going to be able to sell it. And so then I need to start having a bit of a plan B at the same time. So a whole mixture of different people, and I guess a whole mixture of different incomes and ages as well.
Yeah, and it's not just business owners. Obviously, you deal with other professionals as well that are very time poor. So
Yeah, but the business owners are good because at least business owners are generally used to paying for professionals, getting other specialists to come in and do stuff, and generally they're good at making decisions. Whereas employee types aren't normally used to that kind of thought process.
yes, it's definitely a different ballgame being in business, that's for sure. So property can easily become a status symbol. So where do you see founders confusing property as a status move versus strategic decision?
Yeah, so for a lot of people, when they buy property, I guess, and especially now that we've got social media around, people want to boast, oh, I've got this penthouse or I own this amount of property, either in terms of volume, in terms of quite often they talk about the number of properties. And normally when someone talks about the number, quite often it means they're 500 grand properties, they're not $1 or $2 million properties. Because the people that are buying decent property in decent locations realize it's about how many $1 million you've got invested that goes up at 5 or 10% rather than having a whole bunch of them at 100 grand, say. So for a lot of people that I guess the real investors, they treat it like a spreadsheet and a property they may not have ever seen. Certainly a lot of mine, like I live within a few kilometers of them, but I could go for a decade without seeing them. But it doesn't matter because as long as the spreadsheet says that I'm getting the rent and that the value is going up, that's the most important thing. And so a good business owner that talks to us about Excel rather than I'm going to go and see it is the kind of people that we love dealing with because we know they're great decision makers.
And who doesn't sell? So what's the difference between buying property to feel successful and buying property to support long-term stability?
Yeah, so I guess the feeling is when you have got that penthouse, and a lot of people talk about or they make excuses in a way, the reasons of why they bought those things to say, oh, I go down to Melbourne once a month, or I go up to the Gold Coast, or I go to this tourist town, and so we have it there. But quite often that's more of an emotional toy and a luxury rather than a real investment. The real investments people don't touch, just like you buy a bunch of shares. You're not going to turn up to those meetings. You're a small fry. You're delegated out. So say for my properties, for instance, I've got 13 or 14, generally around the eastern suburbs or eastern beaches and kind of Coogee Bondi type thing, and a couple over in the UK. But they're not properties I'd ever live in. I did live in some in my 20s, but I wouldn't aspire to live in them now. Like, they're great properties, they're $1 or $2 million, but it's not something to boast about. I haven't got the best one on the street. It's not on the beachfront. It's generally a few blocks back. It's generally a 50 or 60-year-old building, not a brand spanking new one. But I just know that's a more solid investment than you get the latest tower, wherever it is, of 500 properties that's all glass. And then suddenly you get the mascot towers type thing that suddenly you bought a lemon and suddenly the whole building's worth nothing. That's the danger of those kind of things that you're buying to boast to other people about.
Yeah, so I guess that kind of touches on the next point, which was how does ego quietly show up in property decisions a little bit?
Yeah. So I'm never kind of showing my properties on social media necessarily. I talk about it as a factual thing, like an accountant, to talk about my yields, my leverage, my cash flow, the average capital growth. So I'm talking about P&L figures. And it's the same with someone in business. We've all met these businesses, and especially in the global financial crisis in 2010 and with COVID, that you suddenly see this high street business. You think it looks absolutely amazing. What a great brand, but they're just about to go bust because they've got no customers, or they're selling for a loss and they're not making any money. And again, is once you're in some of these business groups, you suddenly start telling the truth to other business owners. And we all know most businesses aren't a 20-hour a week job or a couple of hours a day. They're all encompassing. You're generally thinking about it 24/7, and you go through the ups and downs. People don't sit around in business with hundreds of thousands or millions in the bank in cash. They're generally struggling with cash flow. Most investors are still doing the same thing. No matter how wealthy they are, they're still trying to juggle these things. And so what you find with real investors is you get to hear about those struggles rather than, yeah, I've got this penthouse, I've got this amazing house, I doubled it in size, but you then realize they've overcapitalized and it's not worth what they paid for it with the renovations.
Yeah, yeah, that's a big danger whenever you're doing any reno on a property, right? So when property is done well, what role does it actually play in a founder's bigger picture?
So this is the funny thing. So I've been investing since I was 22, like say 23 years. Oh, sorry, 33 years, 55 next week.
We get there
And
too.
and I've also been around a lot of business groups as well for the last kind of 15 years with things like EO, the Entrepreneurs Organization. And just like we were saying before, is a lot of businesses don't make a profit. So quite often the buying the property is the plan B. But a lot of businesses that say buy property, say within their super to house their business, like they've got a warehouse or an office premises or something like that, quite often the most amount of money they've actually made is actually through their business premises, not through their business profits. And the same is for quite often professionals. Like my dad was a cardiologist, a doctor, but on retirement, effectively, most of his wealth was all in the family house because the wages kind of paid for the day to day. And I guess that's in business. The business pays for the day to day runnings of our lives and paying for the kids' school fees and all that kind of jazz. Whereas often our properties or our homes make the real money. And so this is what I find in business is a lot of people say, right, okay, I'm going to put my profits into, I've already got my family home. I'll go and buy an extra investment property or two or three. But quite often what they find is that plan B actually turns into their plan A that actually makes more money and more wealth creation and more leverage and less stress and no staff than their actual business. So it really turns it on its head. And that's what I basically did in my 20s. So I suddenly realized I bought so at 22, I basically could afford £10,000, borrow three times your income. That would be a crappy little unit in the worst part of town. I leveraged through the roof, borrowed eight times my income and bought a 3-bedroom house, rented 2 rooms out and lived for free. And I basically bought £100,000 place for 80,000 because I wasn't in a chain and I could do an instant transaction. So I basically made 2 years' salary overnight and lived for free. And it was at that age of 22 that I was lazy and I thought, working hard for a living to earn £10,000 when I've just made £20,000 overnight, and I then refinanced it and got a free Porsche. I couldn't afford a Porsche on the lease, but through the equity I got one, and so I thought, I've got a free house and I've got a free Porsche. This is magic. And that's, I worked on my plan B at the age of 22 and 23 and building up rather than building a massive career. So, sure, I'm reasonably well known in property for being on Sky News and things like that, but I'm not a career driven person because my career was my plan B in a way. My plan A was always my property.
I love that. You earn 20K overnight and then buy a Porsche. All because you were lazy.
And again, people say, and they especially did in those days, you've used debt to buy a depreciating asset, which is seen as a bad thing. But if I'd sold that property for 100 grand and I'd made 20 and I wouldn't have paid tax because I lived in the property. But if I'd used that to then buy a 15 grand Porsche, people would say, well, that's okay because you're paying for that with profits. But then you've got no house. Whereas I've still kept that property, and that property is now worth maybe £600,000 or £700,000. And so this is the thing, is you can take money out, because a lot of people say, if you never sell, how do you take money out? Well, effectively, that's what I did, is I borrowed against the property. So maybe I had a 80 grand loan to buy the property, and then I had a 15 grand loan, which is non-deductible debt for the Porsche. But I still had by then a £120,000 asset that continued to ride to £600,000 or £700,000. So in a way, you can have your cake and eat it, and it's much better to keep that asset constantly rising than sell it and splurge on the profits.
It's very smart. So it feels like properties, it's probably better to try and think about doing it alongside the business and support the business so that they're not competing. It's about doing them together to make it a better wealth strategy.
Yeah, and what I find with a lot of people, when their business goes through a few ups and downs, quite often they sell that property to then go and fund their business. But in certain cases, it's better pulling back on the business, because the thing that's making you all the money, you're using to fund a loss-making business or a business that's in strife. And sure, you don't want to, the emotional things of shutting down your business is tough, but it's maybe just pull back on it rather than keep putting good money after bad, and just kind of lay low until the market changes and then build things up after that, rather than throwing away your best assets.
No, that's very good advice. So one of the hardest questions founders face is when to invest. So what signals tell you someone's actually ready versus just feeling restless, bored, or burnt out?
Yeah, people don't deal with logic. So my first speech that I ever did 20 odd years ago was to CPA Australia. First ever speech. I'm afraid of public speaking like everyone else, but I spoke as a young 30-year-old, maybe 32, to 700 accountants at their congress in Darling Harbour. And I took them through the philosophy of rent vesting. And I said at the start of the speech, right, who reckons you should pay off your own home? And all these accountants put two hands up. It's non-deductible debt. Yes, we should pay it off. And then I went through the whole process saying, well, your house, I can basically rent for 1% yield. And if I went and invested the equivalent somewhere else, I could get 4 or 5% yield. So based on that, say if you're in a $1 or $2 million house, I could live in a $3 or $4 million for the same price, but still have a couple of $1 million invested. And obviously the accountants got the logic. The numbers were pretty quick, but they understood the numbers. And I thought, I'm never going to have to market again. I've got 700 accountants in the room. But even though I managed to maybe convince them 99.9%, there was still that 0.1% in an accountant's mind to say, oh, what if? Or no, that just goes against the grain. I've got to pay off non-deductible debt and I've got to live in my own home. It's capital gains free. And so it's from that point that I realized that people don't think logically. So the best time to buy, say at the moment, we're in kind of April 2026, there's wars going on around the world. Interest rates are going up. They're talking about capital gains tax discount being reduced. They're saying that confidence levels are lower than they were at COVID. That's the time to buy. Now, of course, all the skeptics say, yeah, well, Chris, you're a buyer's agent. You're always going to say it's a good time to buy. And look, fair enough. I have got a vested interest. But logic says, if no one else is buying, there's more stock on the market. people, as serviceability has gone down because interest rates have gone up, that's a great time to negotiate. But people don't buy now. They buy, say, in a year or two when the market starts recovering and they start dropping interest rates because maybe we go into recession, just like we had in COVID. Rates were going up, then they went down to almost nothing. Everyone jumps in the market at the same time, and we had 20 or 30% growth pretty much around the country within 12 months. That's when people want to buy, because they say to their workmates, I'm buying, and say, oh, so am I. It's a great time. Property market's going up. But that means you're competing and you're probably paying 5 or 10% more than you could have bought it for a couple of months ago. Whereas if you go into the office now and say, hey, I'm thinking about investing, they say, haven't you heard about the wars, the interest rates, the capital gains, Donald Trump, all this other stuff? You're absolutely mad. And so a real investor comes in at these times. So I bought in the global financial crisis, which was 2009, 2010. I bought half my portfolio then. I bought a massive block of units and did a massive renovation and basically made $1 million in 3.5 months. And I've still got it now, and it's more than doubled since 2010. That's the sign of a true investor, that they're unemotional. And look, we had a call yesterday from a young couple in their 20s. I think they earned maybe about 300 grand between them, so roughly 150 each, which was great income for two young people. And they've got a deposit and they're good to go. And it's like, great time to invest. But most people are more skeptical and they follow the sheep, which isn't the best idea.
Yes, I heard advice a very long time ago when it comes to investing is that the best time to invest is always in the winter, the financial winter.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
always,
And again, if you're investing by the beachside suburbs, investing in winter is not a bad thing because no one's at the beach.
no one wants to think about it because it's too cold.
But the reality is, or my rule that I use for myself was, I buy when I can get the money from the bank, when I've got a deposit, and when I've got enough buffer to basically put in my offset to counter the bad times if they get any worse. And I can buy a property on a conservative valuation. That's my choice of investing.
Sounds very smart and non-emotional.
Exactly. And that's what they say. It's like with accountants, how emotional are accountants? And the answer is obviously zero. And so that's why I tend to be a reasonable investor and quick at making decisions. But obviously, when I got married, I had to learn emotion, because being a husband, then you need a bit more emotion than an accountant.
So, what risks do you see when founders rush into property at the wrong time? Like, what's the biggest one?
Yeah, I think the wrong time for people is when they're doing it because they're seeing everyone else around them doing it, and they just want to join the sheep. And it's not to say that there's a bad time. So even in a boom, I'd still buy. Again, if I can buy it on a conservative valuation price, and it's ticking all the boxes. So them following one of their mates that suddenly invested in this country town, or they've suddenly seen some guru that's going to go and do things. And in property, we tell our clients, don't even trust us. Let's get independent valuations to prove what it's worth, that effectively they've got PI insurance. We only invest in the best suburbs, like the Coogis, the Bondis, the Manleys, the Leichhardts, the Balmains, the suburbs that are slow and steady wins the race. They're not hyped. They're not pumped up by someone on social media, versus a country town where previously they weren't selling any properties. Someone else gets in first. They then promote it to get everyone else in. It turns into a pyramid scheme, and then they kind of get out 5 years later. Those are the worries. So the ones that are after the latest trends, obviously AI is the word of the year these kind of days. I've got all this AI research. I've done all this data and the rest of it. I wouldn't be trusting my future wealth of my family based on AI rather than fundamentals and stuff. People that are chasing the latest tax thing, whether it's first homeowner grants that are trying to get you to go from a normal suburb to a house and land one in Western Sydney in the middle of nowhere where there's 1,000 other house and land packages. NDIS, like, we've had all of these things over the years, and they come out as great schemes. And then you hear the realities that, yes, I get 30%, but I only get it when I get a tenant, and I haven't had a tenant for 12 months. We had another client or potential client that says, oh yeah, and I've got these properties in Queensland. I get a 20% yield. And then he said, when I get it. And I said, oh, what do you mean by that? And he said, oh, well, it's a whole bunch of rat bags that we get in there. So they only last 2 or 3 months. Then it's hard enough to get a property manager because they're kind of rat bags as well. And they don't want to try and find the rat bag tenants. And so it's a spiral kind of scheme. So we probably only get 3 or 4 months of getting rent in, which basically means you get a 3 or 4% yield and you've got damage to deal with. So again, if it's too good to be true, it's too good to be true.
What do business owners underestimate about trying to do property on their own?
Look, property is not the hardest thing in the world. So what I find is when people buy their own homes, wherever they are in Australia or around the world, they generally do well because they're trying to find properties that are close to transport and schools and work and beaches and restaurants and bars and stuff like that. And they generally do quite a bit of due diligence because they're going to live in it in themselves. But when it comes to investments, they'll fly to Bali for a weekend or fly to Queensland or wherever they're going, and then they kind of buy it on a sniff of an oily rag. They don't do any due diligence. They rely on the people that they're working with, and it can be pretty scary. So it's not to say you can't do it yourself, but most people can't take that emotion out of it. And so when they do use professionals, say like us as buyers agents, again, we've done it for 20 or 30 years. We're doing it all day, every day. We just know our trade. We know the agents that deal with us, that have dealt with us for 20 or 30 years. You get over the odd little lies and the rest of it because we've been around long enough. Whereas they meet a new person, there's a few little truths or grey truths that kind of come out and the rest of it, and they play a bit of a game. But when you've dealt with someone for 20 or 30 years, you don't play games anymore. You get down to the truth because they know if they burn us, then they're burning us for the next 20 or 30 years. And so it's just like if you're in the car trade and I want to go and buy a car. If you're buying 1,000 as a fleet manager every year or 100 or whatever else, you're going to do it better than the person that's buying their family car because they're in the trades. They know the deals. They know which years of cars don't work and what problems they have. And it goes the same with property. And so a lot of people think, and especially if they've got one partner at home, it's not necessarily always the wife, but people have an interest and they say, oh, yeah, but we know everything that goes on in our suburb. We can definitely go and buy. But again, it's too much emotion. They end up paying, say, on $1 million valuation that we would pay, and we wouldn't go to auction, they would pay maybe $1,050,000 or 1.1. And their argument is, look, I only paid $1,000 more than the next person. But it just means that you've got one person pre-approved to 1.1, one pre-approved to 1.2. They haven't done the due diligence to know on a bad day it's only worth $1 million. And under the competition of auction, they think, yeah, I've only paid another $1,000. But no, you've got two Muppets that haven't got a clue and they paid 100,000 over. And that's what the agents love. The agents are very, very good in these suburbs. They're the best in the country. They're highly trained. They're highly skilled. They know how to market properties and take your focus off in not having parking in the middle of summer by the beach because you're there on a rainy day in the middle of winter and there's plenty of parking around. So it's all of these little things. But again, the skeptics say, I can do it myself. It's always easier.
Certainly speak from experience. It's very draining for property. I don't know how you guys do it. Hats off.
But again, it's when you do something for a living, you have a different relationship with people because you're buying volume. And that's the thing. And so whatever industry you're in, if I try and come into your industry and try and do it from scratch, you're making mistakes, and mistakes cost money, both in the time of doing it, or if you go and buy a lemon of a property which doesn't rise for 10 years, you've lost a whole market cycle. So you might have bought the property for $1 million and sold it for $1 million, say, oh, look, I didn't really lose anything. But the opportunity cost of $1 million doubling to two, and in between every few $100,000 you pulled it out and you kept repeating, you might have bought 3 or 4 properties over that 10 years, and suddenly your million's gone to 4 or 5 million. But people never look at that kind of stuff.
Opportunity cost is a really big thing. So
yeah, and it's like recruitment as well. Then they say, oh, anyone can recruit. You just put an advert online, you go and get someone. But we all know the cost of recruiting a bad person, especially in a corporate. It's almost probably double their wage because you get them in, you've then got to performance manage them. It takes you 3 to 6 months to get them out. All that lost opportunity, all that lost management time, and then you've still got to then go and find another one. Or you could just pay a recruiter similar money to us. It's like probably 20 grand or 15 grand to go and hire someone. But you've got a professional that has seen thousands of candidates, that they know when someone's lying and they're bullshitting on their CV and stuff like that, that they haven't got a clue how to do the job.
Yeah, yeah. Professionals are pretty much underrated in what their value brings, I think, especially when you talk about that particular price point for so many of those. They're really not that much if you look at the time that it saves, the opportunity that you save, and especially in your game, quite often you're getting properties at much less to what's actually on the price guide that they like to put on this.
Yeah. And again, the reason being, because a lot of people think, oh, why would an agent sell something to you for $1 million when they could take it to auction for 1.1? And there's a couple of different reasons. Because sometimes they say, well, an agent's incentivized to get more money. But if they sell a property for $1 million, they make 20 grand, of which quite often they get half, and half goes to, say, the McGrath or Ray White or whoever they work for. So they're making, say, 10 grand. If they sell it for 1.1 million, they make 22, of which they get 11. So is an agent really going to work hard to do open homes 2 or 3 times a week, to deal with all the tire kickers for an extra $1,000? Or is he going to try and sell that property quickly so he can sell a second or a third or a fourth in that month? And again, they say it the other way. They say, oh, the buyer's agent, oh, we're incentivized to get our clients to pay more money. Whether we charge 20 grand at $1 million or 22 for 1.1, are we really going to get a client to pay $100,000 more so we make another $2,000? Or are we better off doing a great deal for the client that he then buys more property and or refers it to our friends? And look, we don't even get into that conversation. We say, look, to get I guess, the emotion out of it, let's get an independent valuation. If you can buy at a really conservative price, you know you've got a cracking deal. Because the average person, not the average person, but a lot of business owners that come that are ego driven because they're such great business people, if we say, right, we can get this property for $1 million, even though they've never even been to the suburb that we're buying in, they say, oh, no, I've looked at it online. There's no way that's worth $1 million. It's only 70 square meters. That's only worth 900. I'm not paying $1 over 900. And then we miss out on it. It goes to auction, it sells for 1.1. And we'll say, well, we haven't told you so, but look, this property we could have got for $1 million. So that you thought was 900 sold for 1.1. And you go through that 3 or 4 times and they'll after that needle in the haystack. And by the time they go and get that, the market's moved to 1.1 or 1.2 million anyway. And so it's just a false economy. And so for a lot of people, we just say, if you're always going to discount things, do you want us to play a game to say, look, we can get this for 1.2 so that you discount it to 1.1, we then go and buy it for $1 million so you feel better? Or should we just tell you the truth to say, we can get this for $1 million, it ticks the boxes, and you should go and buy it? And for some people, it's just, you just can't win. And so sometimes we just say, look, sorry, I don't think we're the right people for you.
I guess so. There's common expensive mistakes that founders make when they don't get the right support. So that's probably some of what you're talking about there.
Yeah. So the classic thing is, it's buying the lemon that doesn't go up. They're trying to buy the next fad that doesn't work. And over the last 10 or 20 years, like a lot of people were buying Southeast Queensland. We had a chat show on Sky for 10 years, and people used to ring up saying, I bought here. Look, it gives me $50 a week, which doesn't really change my life. It's only a couple of grand a year. But 10 years later, it hasn't moved. Now, obviously, in the last few years, Brisbane's kind of recovered a bit and it has gone up, which is great news for them. And Perth is a classic. So a lot of people bought into Perth the last 5 or 6 years, and look, it has doubled, which is great. If you've managed to time it, good on you. Fair enough. But from 2007 to 2021, the median price was roughly 500 grand, and it didn't change. And we've got buyers agents over there, and they changed their models more to go for industrial and for home purchases because no investors were going there. It had been flat for 14 years. And that's the classic thing is, people might say, oh, yeah, my property's doubled in 7 years. They may have held it for 20 years. They didn't tell us about the first 14 years. And it's actually consistency what you want. Because if you invested in even Sydney or Brisbane, or sorry, Melbourne or Brisbane that hadn't done as much, if it means that every few years you can pull the equity out and keep repeating, or you can pull the equity out just to fund your negative gearing, it's that compound effects that makes more money. So we're not actually after the latest, greatest high growth things, because you're never going to time it, just like the property market, or sorry, the share market. You want consistency. Slow and steady wins the race. The hare and the tortoise. We've heard it multiple times. Everyone wants to be the hare, but we all know that the tortoise wins.
So I'd love to talk about property through a founder lens. So how should business owners think about property in relation to cash flow, energy and capacity, not just growth?
Yeah, they really need to treat it like an accountant, I think, even if they're not one. And look, there's plenty of business owners that still can't read their P&L and balance sheet, and they haven't got a clue. And maybe they've got a part-time financial controller. They need someone to look at it the same way, whether it's them or it's their advisors at the same thing, to say, look, I need to divest. I need to have a plan B. I'm making money. I'm putting some maybe into my home, maybe paying that home off. But at the same time, the more options I have, the better, because it's an ever more changing world now than it was 10 or 20 years ago. And then thinking that with property, you could typically buy a property, say regional Australia, say, and it costs you nothing to hold on to. But maybe it only grows at 3, 4, 5%. So say you buy a property and it maybe goes up 5% a year, say 25, 50 grand. Or you go and buy one in a blue chip area that maybe costs you 20 grand a year, but then maybe grows by 80 or $100,000 a year. Now, for the average Aussie, they can't afford to buy these Bondi type properties that cost them 20 grand because they haven't got that spare capacity within their wages, whereas typically business owners have. And so the numbers work out better, that obviously something to cost you 20 that makes you maybe 70 or 80 nets you 50. Whereas if it costs you nothing, but you only maybe make 25 or 50, you're making less money. And ultimately it's about capital growth, because you don't pay tax on the capital growth. And if you're losing 20 grand, that comes off your income. So you get some money back in terms of tax. And so it's really a seesaw. The more money it costs you, probably the more money you're going to make. And the less it costs you, the more you're probably buying regionally. And look, it may take off like a Perth did, or it may sit there doing nothing. And so generally, if you look at what the banks do, the banks are more than happy to lend to first home buyers at 95 or almost 100% in these blue chip areas, because they know the bank's money's safe there. As soon as you go more regional, or you go to areas with massive supply, say in CBDs or the Parramatta's, or you look at where Meriton builds kind of thousands and thousands of apartments, they're more worried about those areas because it's massive supply, limited demand. So that's probably the biggest thing I learned from Sky News. All this stuff about housing affordability and wages not keeping up with inflation. They say if there's no more property, i.e. eastern suburbs, lower North Shore in the west, where there's 3-story height limits, and there's a high demand from, like these young kids yesterday that were in their 20s earning 200 or 300 grand between them. They've got the disposable income to continue to push the prices up and to pay more rents. And that's why, again, you see all these current affair shows with 50 or 100 people queuing up to rent a $1,000 a week in Bondi or Coogee or Manly or whatever. That's supply and demand.
It's a really big thing, because I've seen, you get some really good rent returns, especially in regional, and it kind of gives you that false sense of security that you're going to get that return, and that the growth will come with it eventually, maybe 30 years. So what changes for business owners when property actually adds calm instead of pressure?
Yeah, so I think it just gives them more security that they don't have to chase the business all the way. So if business is suddenly a bit quieter, they don't have to pour millions and millions of dollars into it to kind of recoup it, because they've got the security of property behind them. And that's what it is. So the idea with property is, as it goes up in value, you pull the equity out, which is based on serviceability. So you do need an income from employment or from your business to let the banks lend you that money. But you can then keep that money in your offset, that if you do need to fund the business a tiny bit, then you could pull some of that equity out. Or if the business is not making a profit, it's not going to kill you. As long as you can pay your team and your suppliers and stuff, you can then rely on your properties to then give you some of that that ultimate wealth. And again, is if you've got the big purchases, that you've got the overseas trips, or you've got the school fees, for instance. Like for a lot of people in their 30s, if you've got young kids, it costs $40,000 or $50,000 now for private school fees, which is 100 grand a year, effectively pre-tax, or kind of you need 100 grand income to then pay 50% tax to pay your 50 grand school fees. So it's a good $1 million per child to put them through. That's very hard to take after tax. Whereas to take that off a property or buy a property before you've got kids, and by the time they're school kids, you even maybe sell that property, pay a bit of capital gains, and then that funds your kids through school or whatever else you need to do.
Can't believe the school fees are that expensive these days. It's insane. They've gone up too. If only we could invest in the school fees.
Exactly. That's the thing, is buy yourself a school, buy yourself a private school.
That's right. It feels like the wrong asset can obviously amplify stress, and the right one can create relief.
Yeah, exactly. And so, again, the more you're chasing the profits and to get overnight success, the bigger risk you're taking and the chances of it happening and causing you grief. So again, hare and the tortoise, slow and steady wins the race, boring, Excel. It's not going to be a great photograph or anything like that. It's not going to be great social media. Who cares if it makes you money and your spreadsheet keeps making you money year after year?
Yeah. Yeah. So many of our listeners run service-based businesses with small teams, and they're still very involved day to day. So how does that reality change how property should be approached?
Well, it's a good thing, because property, the main benefit of property, especially residential over kind of commercial industrial, is that it leverages your time and it leverages your money. So I've got, I think, 13 or 14 properties, roughly worth, say, 20 or 25 million, both here and in the UK. Again, I don't go and see them every month or even every year. Once a month, at the end of the month, I get the property management statements from the property manager. I just enter those into Excel to make sure, as my due diligence, that the tenants have paid the rent and the property manager's actually physically given it to me. And that's based on prior experience of a property manager sending me statements but never actually paying my bank account. So it's a simple Excel. So that's 14 numbers I put in every month. And then I know, say, on the 18th of the month, my mortgages go out. So on the 17th, I just double check that there's enough money in the offsets to pay all those mortgages so I don't bounce them, because you never want a black mark. And then I double check on the 18th or the 19th that the money's gone through and it's all cleared and that's all fine. So that can be done by a PA. I manage it myself because I like to keep control on it. But even so, that maybe takes half an hour a month. And then maybe I get one or two emails from the property manager. But I typically say, look, all of my properties are renovated when I buy them. So either it's renovated before or I do the renovation. And then I say, if it's under $1,000, look, just go and do it. Sure, send me an email if you need me to make a decision. But if I've got a leaky tap or a blocked toilet, what am I going to do? You just don't need that kind of stuff. And people say, oh, property managers cost you money, but they generally generate more money than they cost, because the legislation with tenants these days is a nightmare, and the tenants know it and you don't. If you don't give them the right document at the right time, you're stuffed. And so they're on top of that legislation. And I reckon a good property manager that knows the market, if they can get me another $10 or $20 a week, they're more than pay for themselves for the year anyway.
Depending on
Yeah. And then probably once a year, I'll go to my mortgage broker to say, right, okay, these are my current property values. This is my serviceability. Is there any equity I can pull out? Now, my accounts are 200 pages. I don't read them. He's got to read them. So it might take him a month or two to refinance, but it takes me an email, and I just send him a Dropbox link and it's done. I sign a few papers if I can refinance. So again, I'm talking a few hours per year if you set it up right and you're used to delegating, which good business owners are good at. Bad business owners aren't, because they're doing it all themselves.
what assumptions do founders often make about property that don't hold true once the business is under pressure?
I guess the biggest thing is, look, property doesn't rise every year. Quite often people talk about property doubling every, say, 10 or 12 years, which is roughly 6 or 7% growth every year, but it doesn't happen like that. Like we saw back in 2021, I think the market rose 20 or 30%. It might do that for a couple of years. Then it kind of tails off a bit, maybe drops down a few percent, and property does go down. And then it starts trickling up again, but nothing noticeable. Everyone jumps in the market again and it goes bang. And so that's the thing, is you get maybe 2 to 4 years of growth, maybe 2 to 4 years of a little downturn, a couple of years of going flat, and that's a property cycle. Now, if you get into more volatile areas, the property markets can go down 20 or 30% because maybe you're just reliant on one industry, which could be brand new property or mining or tourism or suddenly Airbnbs. Like in COVID, suddenly Airbnb was banned. Then it was suddenly went gangbusters. And then they said, oh, you can only do it for 180 days. So if you're reliant on those things, it is going to be more volatile. But if you're on 12-month leases, normal kind of property, median price range, so the average person can afford to buy, rent, or kind of sell it, then it's generally, again, slow and steady wins the race. It's a more comfortable journey that's not a major thing. But yeah, you go and chase the big bucks, and that's when you'll get volatility and your focus will go off your business. Yeah, I mean, it's like doing Airbnb. So a lot of people do Airbnb themselves, and sure, the profits look really healthy out there, which is great. But these days, you've then got to be a social media kind of marketing genius and also then a pricing one, because you've got to be across Airbnb, booking.com, stays, whatever all those other things are. Again, I've tried a couple of Airbnb properties. I give it to an agency that do it all day, every day. There's no way I can compete with their logic, the genius of some of the people working for them probably working AI and doing all these reports because they're managing thousands of properties. They know the trends. They can see it straight away. I'd be 6 months behind the ball. You just wouldn't have a clue.
When you talk about playing the long game with property, what does that actually look like for a business owner, and how do you help clients avoid feeling trapped by the decisions that were meant to create freedom?
Yeah. So look, when I invest in property, ultimately I'm looking 30, 40, 50 years. Probably not 50 years now because I'm turning 55. So I don't think I'll live that long. But it's having that kind of focus, or at least one property cycle of maybe 10 years or something like that. That's what you're generally looking at. And don't think it's going to be a cash cow that you can pull money off the table straight away. I mean, I managed to do it in the UK, as I said, that I managed to buy within a couple of years, pulled the money out to buy a Porsche and bought a second property. In GFC, I bought that block of units, made $1 million within 3 months, which is great. But that's not normal circumstance. And so you've got to think of it as safe and solid. It's your backup. It's a good, solid foundation for your family's wealth that suddenly, over a couple of years, you're suddenly going to make a fortune. But then for quite a few years, it's going to settle down and you're not. So you almost get this payday a couple of times a decade type thing, which is amazing. Like in COVID, I think mine went up 5 million within a year or two or something like that. But for the few years before, you're twiddling your thumbs saying, hey, when's this property market going to take off? But you can't influence it like you can influence a business. We can't change rates. We can't change Donald Trump. We can't change all these other things going on in the world. And so you've just got to live with it. And that's where you have your buffers to deal with that kind of stuff. So the idea is you concentrate on your business. Now, even for people in the building trade, for instance, they say, oh, I can be more active and the rest of it, and I can develop properties. But the bank's not going to recognize your income unless you've bought a whole bunch of properties, you've turned them around, you've sold them. You can show that you've demonstrated that you're a property trading business. So even for a builder that can build for less than the average person, most of the time the advice is you're better off getting involved in your business, get more customers, turn over more money, create more income that gives you more serviceability that you can then put into buy and hold properties. And that is a sustainable model moving forward rather than going kind of feast to famine all the time trying to get the finance from the bank. Because 20 or 30 years ago, everything was about getting a deposit and using a low doc loan. Now everything is about having serviceability to prove to the bank that even if you've got $1 million paid off home, you have got some extra income there to service future loans and future repayments.
Yeah. What can structure be when you're looking at building a portfolio?
Yeah, look, structure can make a difference, and there's been a lot of talk about this in the media and on socials of people having a separate trust for every single property, and as long as it was cash flow positive, then they wouldn't have to declare it the next time they put another application into the bank. And look, some of this is partially true, but the reality is a lot of properties aren't cash flow positive unless you're putting massive deposits in. The main thing is to be close to your mortgage broker, because they're the ones that are the most important in a way. So again, the old days, you go to your accountant and say, minimize my tax. Then you go to the mortgage broker and they say, well, you can't borrow any money because you don't pay any tax. And people say, oh, I've got a great accountant, don't pay any tax. Now, the method is you go to your mortgage broker to say, how much money do I need to earn to be able to do what I want to do from a borrowing perspective? And then going to your accountant saying, this is the accounts I need to see. Now, obviously, we're not talking about defrauding anyone or doing the wrong thing. But again, there's a massive difference between putting a sales invoice in or a purchase invoice on the 30th of June or the 1st of July. So we're talking about doing genuine transactions and tax planning. And in a way, for a lot of people, bringing your profits forward means that you're paying more tax, which keeps the Australian tax man kind of happy. And yeah, you're paying less tax later on. So it's then just trying to manage things. And again, as Kerrie Packer said in court, no one wants to pay more tax because we don't think the governments are that good at using it. But anyone that doesn't plan around that is obviously pretty stupid. And so this is what it is. So having a mortgage broker, an accountant, a buyer's agent that all work as a team, just like you have a team in your business of sales, marketing, accounting, distribution, stuff like that. You've got your own private wealth team at the same time, even if you're only worth $1 million or something like that. That's the main thing.
Yeah, no, that's good advice, because so many founders will often pay themselves the least amount of money, and then, great for tax purposes, like you said, but then obviously when it comes to lending, it's all of a sudden, oh no, you can't do that.
Exactly. And they get to retirement, they say, I've paid no tax the whole of my life. I've operated in cash. But what have you got to show for it? Well, you've got no assets because you haven't been able to borrow, versus the person that pays $500,000 tax. Well, it's a good sign that you've earned $1 million. So if you've got to pay your tax sometime, then it is what it is. But property is good for that, because typically, like we said with that blue chip example, you're losing 20 grand to make that 70 or 80 grand. You're getting tax relief on the 20, and you're not paying capital gains on the 70 or 80 until you sell it, which could be in 30 or 40 years' time. But obviously, we know the government could change anything. So who knows what's going to change tomorrow? And I guess to answer your question fully with the structuring, if you're buying for 30 or 40 years, whatever the accountant or your lawyer puts in place now, they can't foresee what's going to happen in 30 or 40 years. And so again, I would structure based on traditional, solid accounting advice, rather than someone's getting you into the latest, greatest fad that the government's going to shut down. And then suddenly the lever will bounce from going in the middle to going there. You think you're winning, and then it suddenly goes all the way the other way. And suddenly you're avoiding tax and you get a slap on the wrist.
There's one thing that we kind of haven't quite touched on yet, and I think it's a really big misconception that a lot of people have, and it's the whole good debt versus bad debt.
Yeah. And so this is the thing. So first of all, the main thing about investing is you should be investing in property for that $1 million or $500,000, $1 million going to two. That's where the money is. And especially if you've leveraged and you've only put 100 or 200 grand down to buy that $1 million property and it's doubled to two. That is where the money is. And the safer you do it, that's where you're going to make your money. Now, whether you have structured it correctly to pay the right amount of tax makes a difference, but that's B or C. Again, even structuring your debt and the rest of it, it makes a difference. But again, that's B and C. It's not the prime reason. The prime reason is to make your money. Just like in business, exactly the same thing. If you've got a mega profitable business, even if you've got no deductible debt, you've structured it completely wrong, you've got it in completely the wrong entity, and it's maybe in your own name, you could get sued and you've got to pay maximum tax, you've got no flexibility, you've still got a profit. That's the biggest thing. So a lot of people do concentrate so much on structuring and then go and buy a lemon. Now, however good your structuring is, if you've got a lemon that doesn't grow up in value, you've got a lemon. You might have a tax efficient lemon, but it's still a lemon. Whereas the idea is to have a tax inefficient profit. Well, look, you learn your lesson. You can maybe restructure it. You can maybe do some things, but at least you've got a profit.
Yeah, yeah. So if you could leave founders with one mindset shift about property and wealth, what would it be?
I think the biggest thing is property being a plan B could actually be your plan A. And there's lots of people that have proven that over the years. So I don't know what the stats are on selling your business, but most businesses aren't saleable, or even if they are, they don't sell, or they don't sell for the multiple that you want, because it's very hard for businesses to be consistent for 10 or 20 years or so. And so you might be going through mega times and then COVID hits or GFC or Donald Trump or the war or whatever else, and suddenly your whole plans have completely disappeared. Whereas the plan B for property, especially when it's residential, because residential is a lot more safe and secure than the other types of property. Quite often think about that could actually be your plan A, and you're running your business to be a cash cow, to give you the cash to do your day-to-day living, to give you the serviceability to get your loans, and then it's your properties that actually pay for your school fees, your round the world trips, your cars, your boats, your handbags, whatever you're into, that kind of stuff. Quite often it's more tax efficient, it's more leveraged, and quite often less risky way to get those things. And then there's the whole thing about rent vesting. So I still don't live in my own home, even though I've had these properties. I haven't lived in my own home for a good 25 years because I buy a whole bunch of properties that rent at 3.5 to 4.5%. And then I go and rent $5 or $10 million homes that rent for 1% because no one can afford them and no one wants to be a poor renter. So again, there's very tax efficient ways and clever ways to do these kind of things. So all of my debt's deductible. Sure, I haven't got capital gains free properties, but if I don't sell them, I'm not paying the capital gains anyway. So who cares if I don't live in my own home? I'd rather live in somewhere 2 or 3 times more expensive for the same money.
Yeah, why not, right? Rent where you want to live.
Exactly. And then we got flooded. So 2 hours before we went to Europe last year, we got flooded, but there was no emotion. It wasn't our property. We sent a text to the kids, go to Meriton Bondi Junction. The nanny will meet you there. We're off to Europe. Don't try and call us because we're on a plane for 24 hours. Whereas if that was my own house, might be a different emotion.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like the best property decisions are the least emotional ones.
So study accounting. This is never for CPA Australia.
Chris, this has been such a grounded conversation about property. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks a lot, Kerrie. Good to chat.
Good to chat. So what stands out for me is that property isn't about excitement. It's about structure, patience and strategy. And for anyone listening, this episode isn't a push to buy something tomorrow. It's an invitation to think more clearly about how your assets support your business and your life. This is the Business Rebellion, and this is what it sounds like to do business differently.